This is the Panasonic Lumix G97, the latest micro four thirds camera from Panasonic. Now, if you wonder why it looks like something that you have seen before, it's because this camera is largely based on the Lumix G90 or G95, depends on where you are from, because the G90 and the G95 are the same camera, but just with a different name for different region. And largely based on maybe a bit of understatement, because the Lumix G97 is almost completely the same as the G90, but with a few minor, even though useful upgrades. I could just use 60 seconds and tell you all the changes and then ask you to watch my Lumix G90 review that I did back in 2019 when I was much younger. But that is not really fun, right? So I will still do a review and we will look at this G90 at the end of 2024. Oh, sorry, I mean the G97, and see how does this camera feels and performs today, and also what does the new changes mean to this camera. But before we start, I want to mention this review is based on a pre-production G97 I borrowed from Panasonic. The camera is running pre-production firmware. Okay, now let's first have a look at the design and operation of this Panasonic Lumix G97. So the body design is a very typical Lumix design. So at the top, we have the big dial here for mode changes, and then the left for different photo shooting mode. And we have the typical Lumix white balance, ISO and exposure compensation adjustment buttons, which is one thing I really like about the Lumix cameras. And we have the twin control dial, one at the back and one at the front. We have the shutter button, and we also have the red video record button. So if you look at the back, we have the EVF at the top. The EVF has a 2360K resolution OLED panel, and the magnification is 0.74 times. So while it's not the best EVF in the market, for a camera of this price and class, it is not too bad. And then we have the flippy tilty screen here that you can tilt and flip in different directions. So the screen resolution is 1840K dot. I believe this is the same panel as the Panasonic Lumix S5 II, which is a pretty good screen. The colors are nice and it is also pretty bright, so even if you have to use it under bright sunlight, it is still very usable. The autofocus mode switch at the top here, D-pad here, and a few other buttons. Some of those are customizable, but this camera doesn't have a joystick. But I don't find it a big problem because you can use the LCD screen as a virtual joystick when you are shooting with the EVF, so you can just slide your finger here and control the autofocus point pretty easily. If you look at the front, there isn't any special customizable buttons on the front of the camera. If you look at this side, we have a memory card door here. Behind it, we have the SD card slot, and it is a high-speed UHS 2 card slot. And if you look at the other side, at the top, we have the microphone input here. And below that, we have 4 different ports here. The headphone port, we have a remote port, the new USB-C port that you can use not just for data but also for charging, and we also have a micro HDMI port at the bottom. The camera has a decent size grip which provides pretty good support. Even when I have to hold the camera and shoot with just one hand, it still feels quite comfortable. Overall, I think the build quality is pretty good for a camera of this price, and it is also a weather sealed body, so if you use it with a weather sealed lens, then it shouldn't be a problem if you have to use this camera, take some photo or video under a bit of rain. The camera also has a built-in flash, which is something I haven't seen in a lot of recent mirrorless cameras. Overall, I quite like the design of this camera because it is something that has been refined over a few generations. So everything is now very sensible and pretty easy to use. But the only thing that I don't like is the camera strap lug is the older style one. So if you are a photographer, then it is perfectly fine. But if you are a videographer, then you may get a bit of noise from the camera strap lug when you are shooting video and the camera is shaking a bit. So the body of the G97 is exactly the same as the G90. The battery and also the official battery grip for the G90 will work on the G97. And if you have accessory like a camera cage for your G90, then you can also use it on the G97. In terms of operation of the camera, since the G97's manual system and processor is the same as the G90, so I thought going back to a camera from 2019, the camera would feel a bit dated. The reason why I say that is every time I use my G85 these days, I feel that camera's interface definitely feel very dated. But I was really surprised because the G97 actually feels very modern. The user interface, the manual system, they are all very similar to the latest Lumix cameras. The camera is also very responsive. It doesn't feel laggy at all. Actually, the camera's startup time seems to be faster than the latest Lumix camera, which has a slow startup time if you haven't used those cameras for a little while. The G97 boot up very fast. The G97 uses a 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor that we have previously seen on quite a few cameras like the GH5, the G9, GX8, and of course the G90. While this is not the latest and the greatest 25 megapixel sensor that we've seen on the GH7 or G9 too, but the performance of this sensor is actually still not too bad. Now, I don't have a GH7 or a G9 II with me, but I shot a set of comparison JPEG file using the G97 and the GH6, which also uses the new 25 megapixel sensor. So this set of photos is from G97's base ISO all the way to the maximum ISO 25600. From the base ISO to ISO 6400, there really isn't too much difference in terms of image quality between the two cameras. Only from ISO 12800 onwards, then we can see some noticeable difference, and the new 25 megapixel sensor delivers better image quality. While the camera's mechanical shutter's fastest shutter speed is only 1/4000 second, you can shoot with the electronic shutter instead, and the shutter speed can go up to 1/16,000 second. The camera also has the live field composite mode, which allows you to do long exposure during the day without having to use any ND filter. This is done by some computational magic, and the result is not exactly the same as the normal long exposure using an ND filter, but it is still a very useful feature, especially when you are traveling and you forgot to bring a ND filter with you. Another similar feature is the 4K photo mode. The camera basically just record 4K video file and then use the video frame to allow you to do things like post-focus, focus stacking, or pre-capture. I myself don't really use the 4K photo mode because I usually like to shoot RAW file, and the 4K photo mode is JPEG only. But I know a lot of people love the 4K photo mode, and this is a feature that is missing from the latest Lumix camera, as when Panasonic moved to the latest Venus engine, they didn't rewrite this feature for the new engine. So if you love the 4K photo mode, this could be the last camera that you can buy that still has this feature. The G97 can record video up to 4K resolution. 4K is up to 30 frames per second, or you can record 1080p video up to 120 frames per second. Just like the other Lumix cameras, both the 4K and 1080p footage are beautiful, especially when there is enough light. But there are a few things that you need to be aware of. Firstly, 4K video has a 1.25 times crop, which means if you're shooting with the 12 to 16mm kit lens, the wide end becomes 30mm equivalent focal length, which is not very wide. So if you want to use the camera with the kit lens to do some vlogging style video, you will probably find the framing is quite tight. So if you really want to do some vlogging video with the G97, then you should consider getting a wider lens. The Leica 9mm f1.7 would be a lens that I highly recommend to you because the image quality is really good, the lens is very compact, and it has a f1.7 maximum aperture. And the price of that lens is also not super expensive. Or you could just shoot in 1080p instead, as the 1080p doesn't have any crop. The camera can also record in V-Log-L flat picture profile, which can capture up to 12 stops of dynamic range. This would allow you to recover blown out highlight much better when you are shooting on a sunny day. However, you need to aware that the G97 can only record video in 8-bit. So while you do have better dynamic range, but if you do some extreme adjustment, you may see artifact because of the limited bit depth. But if you need to deal with high dynamic range, it is still much better than the 8-bit video recorded in normal picture profile. Just like the G90, the G97 also uses DFD autofocus system. This is Panasonic's contrast-based autofocus system. Autofocus when taking photo in single AF mode is very fast and accurate. The camera has face and eye detection, but it doesn't offer animal or any other type of subject detection unlike some of the latest Lumix cameras. Continuous autofocus, especially when you are shooting video, is DFD's biggest weakness. So this time with this new G97, it gives me a good reason to retest the DFD autofocus performance for continuous tracking. So the G97's autofocus performance in video mode definitely feels slow, and sometimes I can also see a bit of background pulsing as well. I won't say the autofocus performance is terrible because I think for average user, it is still very usable. But let's say Panasonic's decision to switch from DFD to PDAF in their latest camera is definitely a right move. There is a big difference in autofocus performance between the DFD G97 compared to the other camera like GH7 that use PDAF. There's one feature the Lumix G97 has, but most of its competitors don't have, is the in-body image stabilizer, IBIS. There are really not that many entry-level or even mid-level crop sensor mirrorless camera that has the IBIS. Look at Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm. Pretty much all of the entry-level cameras don't have IBIS, even though I think IBIS is such an important feature for both photographers and videographers. Yes, you can use lenses that has built-in optical image stabilizer to give you image stabilization, but then you're really limiting your lens choice. For example, most of the smaller prime lenses in the market don't have optical image stabilizer, no matter what brand you are looking at. G97's IBIS has a 5-stop rating, which is not really that high in today's standard. The kit lens for the G97 is the Lumix 12-60, which also has optical image stabilizer. And the optical image stabilizer can work with the camera's IBIS together to give you dual IS2, which gives you better stabilization results at longer focal length as the IBIS becomes not so effective with longer focal length. I didn't do any photo mode IBIS test this time because I already did it when I reviewed the G90, which should have the same IBIS performance as the G97. So in my G90 review, I found the IBIS was around 3 to 4 stop effective when shooting photo at 50mm equivalent focal length. It's actually not too bad, only about 1 stop less effective when compared to some of the latest camera that I have tested recently. So that is for photo mode. And for the video mode, I did do a few tests. First, here is a test comparing G97's IBIS with no IBIS at all. I have the two cameras mounted on a solid rig and record the video at the same time. You can see the G97's IBIS reduced the camera shake pretty effectively. But what about if I compare to some other camera? First, I did a comparison with my Fujifilm X-H2. The X-H2 has a 7-stop effective IBIS, so the Fuji should be quite a bit better than the G97. But look at this side-by-side test. I use a prime lens that doesn't have optical image stabilizer on both cameras, so I'm just testing the IBIS itself. Surprisingly, the video from the G97 is just so much more stable than the X-H2. I was a bit surprised by the result, but I did this test twice and got similar results from both tests. So yes, the 5-stop effective G97 is more stable than the 7-stop effective X-H2. And now let's compare with one of the newer Lumix Micro Four Thirds flagship, the GH6. GH6 IBIS has a 7.5 stops rating. I myself have used the GH6 to shoot a lot of video, and I know GH6 IBIS is really good. Maybe not as good as the latest GH7, but I would say it's probably still better than 99% of cameras in the market even today. Now look at this side-by-side result. The GH6 is better than the G97. It is more stable, especially when I start running. But at the same time, I think G97's IBIS is still really quite good, and the performance is not too far from the GH6. And remember, the G97 is a camera that costs less than $850 with the kit lens, and this is supposed to be using IBIS technology from 2019. Now, apart from the USB-C port and the upgrade LCD screen that I mentioned earlier, there are still a few other hidden improvements that come with the G97. First, the Bluetooth is now upgraded from the 4.2 to 5.0 standard. In theory, Bluetooth 5.0 should give you better range and speed, but I don't know if it actually gives us any real-world benefit on the G97. I didn't notice any difference, but at least it is now moved to a newer Bluetooth standard. But one related improvement is that the G97 can now use the Lumix Sync app, unlike the G90 that can only use the much older Panasonic Image smartphone app. While I would love if the G97 can use the brand new Lumix Lab app, but given that the G97 doesn't have any real-time LUT support, and currently some features are still missing from the Lumix Lab, so able to use the Lumix Sync app is still a good upgrade. The camera can also support vertical video shooting. So if you hold the camera vertically when you are shooting video, the video you shot will automatically display vertically when you play back on a computer or a smart device. So you don't need to use a video editing feature to rotate the video yourself. One more small improvement is that there is a red record frame border displayed on the screen when you are shooting video, so you can see very clearly if you are recording video or not. By the way, the camera comes in the new eco-friendly packaging, which is mostly cardboard, and it has very minimal amount of plastic inside, basically just some small plastic bags. The size of this new packaging is also smaller as well, but the camera also doesn't come with a stand-alone charger anymore. I believe this is due to the new EU regulation for devices that can be charged by USB-C port. When I first heard of this Panasonic Lumix G97 and Panasonic gave me a briefing and told me what this camera is, my first feeling was a bit disappointed. The G97 is really just a G90 with a few small updates. I understand this is an entry-level camera, so I really wasn't expecting any groundbreaking features or changes. But honestly, I really want to see a little bit more difference. I don't know what I want exactly, but I just want to see something more because the G90 was from 5 years ago. I guess the reason why I want to see something more is that with the arrival of this Lumix G97, it means there probably won't be another Micro Four Thirds camera at this price point from Panasonic for quite a while. So it means people who are looking at buying a camera at this price point, this 2019 camera with some minor update is Panasonic's offer for 2024, 2025, or maybe even longer than that. But then, one of the evening, I was still upset and I can't sleep. I suddenly remember camera companies have been doing things like this for ages. Even back in the DSLR days, I remember Canon would release a new entry-level DSLR every 1 to 3 years, and the new model quite often is just a very minor update compared to the previous model. And that was back in the DSLR days when the cameras were sold in much higher volume, so the camera companies would probably have a lot more R&D budget. And another thing is, now after using this camera for about 2 weeks, I realized this 2019 camera with minor update is still not a bad camera at all, even at the end of 2024. The 20 megapixel sensor, while it's not the latest, it still performs okay even when I compare to the newer sensor. The IBIS performance is surprisingly good and can even beat the latest flagship camera from other brands. And remember, most other entry-level cameras don't even have the IBIS. The EVF and the LCD are both okay. The camera still feels quite responsive and the body design doesn't really feel dated. And even though this is an entry-level camera, it still has all those dials and buttons and switches just like a mid-range camera. The only thing that is missing is a joystick at the back, but you can use the touchpad AF to replace that. The camera also has tons of features like live field composite mode, 4K photo mode, so there are a lot of extra stuff that a lot of its competitors don't offer. The only thing that I found is not great would be the autofocus system for video. It is usable, but it definitely feels slow and not responsive. I think if Panasonic can put their latest PTAF autofocus system to this camera, then this G97 would be the perfect entry-level camera. But as I've explained in my other video recently, changing the autofocus system is not as easy as just adding PTAF. It would require changing to the latest processor as the older Venus engine cannot handle PTAF. And the newer processor requires more power. That means you will need to upgrade to a bigger, higher power battery. The camera will probably need a new motherboard and upgrade the cooling system, etc. And with all these changes, it probably also need a new body as well, as all this new hardware wouldn't be able to fit in the G90 body. So of course, Panasonic could put PTAF on the G97, but by doing that, the camera would result in pretty much a completely different camera, and the price of the camera will likely go up significantly as well. But anyway, if you don't need the most responsive and fastest video autofocus performance, then this Lumix G97 is really a great entry-level camera. So as I said, I was really a bit disappointed when I first heard of this Lumix G97. But now, after testing it and using it for a while, I can start to see the value of this camera, and I think it could be a great entry-level camera for a lot of people.